And finally, in this week's issue, Peter Hitchens laments the loss of Britain's small rail lines. He joins me now, along with the railway historian Christian Wolmar, the author of Railways of the Raj. So, Peter, you start your piece with a eulogy for a railway line which no longer exists. Can you tell us about it?
Oh, it's the old Cambridge to Oxford line, which I used to take when I was at school in Cambridge and lived in Oxford in the 1960s, knowing that it was doomed. You could tell just from looking at it. And I'd seen so many railways close around me by then that I was fairly sure that it had been given the black spot by somebody, and then it just did close. But it was a wonderfully picturesque and ancient thing. It was diesel-hauled. It wasn't particularly old-fashioned in that way, but it just rambled and pottered and shuddered through some completely unspoilt and quiet parts of England, which now you couldn't reach, really, and if you did reach them by car, you'd ruin them by getting to them. The great thing about railways in the countryside was that they were a way of the modern world mixing with the ancient world without spoiling it, and that's something we've completely lost.
A line between Cambridge and Oxford seems quite a good route. Why was it shut down?
Nobody knows. The hated Dr. Beeching, who was himself the handmaiden of the ghastly Ernest Marples, didn't actually recommend closing it in his notorious report. Harold Wilson just shut it, and nobody really knows why. Obviously it didn't make any money, but almost no railways make any money, and it was one of the very few lines that ran from east to west. And it would, if it had been kept, have been tremendously useful for goods and passengers alike, for routing them around London. And it's not that it's closed to passengers now. Since privatisation, large chunks of it seem more or less to have evaporated. I don't quite know how it is that long lengths of steel track have ceased to be there, but they don't seem to be there anymore when I go and look at it.
Christian, do you also lament the decline of Britain's small railways?
Well, yes and no. Yes, of course, there's a lot of lines that shouldn't have been closed. Some would inevitably have been closed because they really were completely uneconomic, and 7 people and a dog might have used them in a week. But I'm not quite as depressed about the state of the railways as Peter, because I went to Glasgow by train yesterday, up on the West Coast Main Line and down on the East Coast, and it's still a wonderful experience, and the views you get once you get north of Preston are absolutely fabulous, and it is the most wonderful way to travel. And if I'd had time, I could have dodged via Barrow and Workington and gone along the Cumbria line, which is by the sea and has some spectacular views. So it's not all lost, Peter.
It's not all lost. No, around where I live in Oxford, for instance, you've got several handsome, pleasant market towns. I'm thinking of Tame and Witney and Wantage and Abingdon, all of which were connected to the railways before Beeching, and you could live in them, and you could start a journey on the railway, and you could end your journey somewhere else equally picturesque on the railway without having to get into a car. But once all these little parts were lopped off, people decided if they were going to start their journey by car, they might as well finish it. And Beeching's whole nonsensical idea was that you could keep the economical lines open and apply the same logic to our nationalised road system. You'd close all the Acacia Avenues and huge numbers of B roads, because they'll never make any money, and concentrate on the big toll roads, and everything else would be cart tracks. It's obviously moronic, both in a business and economic way, but people accept it blindly as if it made sense.
No, I mean, I quite agree that there were lines that should not have been closed. Certainly Oxford, Cambridge, which he didn't actually, as you say, recommend, should never have been closed, nor should the Great Central Line, which would basically could have been transformed into an HS2.
Well, it was built to continental gauge, so trains from Germany and France could have run on it. It was the only railway in Britain, and they just closed it.
Absolutely, but you must admit that some of the village to village lines. I mean, if you look at a map in my book Fire and Steam, where I had a map of Scotland, Scottish railways in the northeast of Scotland, and there's a whole lot of lines north of Aberdeen, which would of course be wonderful to travel upon now, but nobody much lives there, and they really weren't economic. So some of those lines had to go.
You're talking about Scotland, but if you look at the home counties, people keep saying how rural life has become almost impossible if you have no car. And this is partly because bus services are completely subject to momentary withdrawal and just stop or don't run. Railway lines aren't like that. Once you've got them, they're there. I have to say that I think if the southeast of England still had a fairly close web of country branch lines, they'd be very much used these days by people who like to live in the country and work in the city. The fact they're not there makes country life and the countryside less pleasant.
No, I agree with that.
Look at the traffic on B roads in the countryside. It's incredibly heavy now, and so much of that could go by train if
No, I agree with
they
that.
hadn't ripped up the
And
line.
there's certain branch lines which have been preserved by heritage railways, which certainly should be reopened. There was an item on the Radio 4 yesterday about people in Minehead and how they couldn't get access to jobs. Now, there's a perfectly good railway there that runs from Minehead to almost to Taunton. It isn't quite connected, and that could serve as a wonderful
I think that was
branch
one
line.
of the ones that John Betjeman rode on in its last days. But here's the interesting thing to me. I'm a political, social and moral conservative. I can't understand why so many of my fellow conservatives seem to think that roads are conservative and railways are socialist. Railways ought to be nationalised, in my view, but roads are nationalised. They are a huge nationalised industry. And in the United States, it was Eisenhower's nationalising of the interstates and putting state money behind them, which destroyed the private railroads in the United States. Why is it that conservatives are so against railways? I don't get it.
Well, unlike you, Peter, as you probably know, I'm of the other political
Exactly.
persuasion.
That's why I brought it up.
And
But you both agree that it should be nationalised, is that?
I think we do, yes. But it's quite a difficult job to actually renationalise some parts of it. But they don't make sense. The actual key point is, as well as being renationalised, they should be reintegrated. You shouldn't have this network rail thing and the train operators thing. And then the rolling stock is owned by another lot of people and the engineering is done by a fourth lot. That is completely
Nobody's
insane.
responsible for anything. I think there are some things which the state runs better than private enterprise does. And there's nothing unconservative about that. Because apart from anything else, the effect of building motorways and roads on countryside and indeed on cities is destructive of the things which conservatives like. The settled, the local, the particular, the old, the things which are valuable because they've been there a long time. They're what's swept away by the road revolution. And I've never understood why more conservatives don't take the position that railways are worth preserving.
Christian, can I ask you, you mentioned going up and down on the railway, and Peter says that the Varsity line was one of the few that went east to west. Why do we have so many railways that go vertically but not laterally across the
And that's
country?
because London was always the centre to get to. The railway company that didn't have a line to London built one. I mean, St Pancras, for example, was built quite late in the railway age because the Midland Railway was desperate to get a link to London that was seen as their economic profitable lines. And that's why we have fewer services that circumvent London, which is a great loss. France is just like us, but Germany is completely different, where they actually have no centre of their rail network and link all the cities.
Germany
very
has no
well.
equivalent of London, does it?
It does, that's why, yes.
Berlin isn't really the equivalent of London, and the major cities are more important. When one looks at the announcement that was made on Tuesday night, it must have been, again, claiming they were going to reverse beaching cuts. One of the other things I saw, another line I used to travel on, a very beautiful line, which used to run up from Exeter round the top side of Dartmoor to Plymouth. Why was it closed in the first place? Every few years, the other line to the southwest is washed away at Dawlish, and they have no way of getting round. And it was obviously sensible to keep it, and yet they just shut it. And what was this mania that went through the British establishment in the early 60s, which caused this?
Well, it goes deeper than that. When the railways were created as four big companies in 1923, we also got for the first time a department for transport, a transport ministry. And right from the start, it was staffed with about a dozen people who dealt with the railways and about 90 or 100 who dealt with the roads. And there was always this concentrate. The car was the future. And nobody ever worked out that the more cars you get, the less good it will be for each additional car user because the congestion will be greater. And beaching happened at just the time when the belief in car was greatest. And therefore that everything could be solved. Motorways were being built at the time, and therefore the car was seen as the solution. And of course, we know now, and we are now investing in the railways massive amounts. We know now that having just cars as your main form of transport just doesn't work.
Do you think there was a Marple scandal as big as the Profumo scandal, and people just haven't heard about it? I tend to think that era was particularly shocking in our national.
Marples was certainly very. Of course,
He
as you
was-
know,
he-
he
he
had
was-
Marples Ridgeway. He built
Yes.
motorways, and I think there was something of a conspiracy. There's been some books on this by Chris Austin and Lord Faulkner, who've written a series of books about this period. And there is definitely elements of a conspiracy between the roads lobby, ministers, and civil servants who disliked the railways. They thought, They were awful. They would drive. Remember, Horse Guards Parade, where we're talking near here, used to be a car park for the civil servants, right? No, it really was.
I remember it well.
And they made a lot of fuss when it was taken, because all the civil servants thought they could drive into central London.
And the fascinating thing about Ernest Marples, who was the Minister of Transport who commissioned Beeching to wreck the railways, was that he ended his career by skipping the country, which is one of the least known political scandals of our age. I wish someone would actually revive it.
Well, somebody did ask me to write a book on Marples, and I might do that.
I think you should. I think this is. He actually, oddly enough, he fled the country by train on the old night ferry, where he could load as much of his worldly goods as he could get into the guard's van, and left his flat in Belgravia empty, and then went off and hid in a chateau in Beaujolais for the rest of his life. And it's one of the most astonishing stories and one of the least known about British politics in the post-war era.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Christian.